I have the great privilege and the honor to introduce our Deputy Director General for Policy of the whole ILO. She has oversight over research, the technical formulation, technical assistance right across the office, across very different areas, of course, through employment policy, working conditions, labor inspection, social dialogue, international labor standards. This morning I was with her in a video conference with a number of women leaders right across Asia. This was organized by the IFC of the World Bank, and it was really quite interesting to see a little bit more and to hear a little bit more of Sandra's story. It's very inspiring and inspirational. During this discussion today with you, I hope that you will also find time to ask her a little bit about how her strategies are in coping with both work and family life, because I thought it was personally very interesting. So can I invite Sandra then to get started?
So very pleased to be here. I have not visited Bangkok since I've been with the ILO for going on 3 years now, and it was great to have this opportunity to come. And I should tell you that I have come primarily to talk with you. I do not have public events here. I've been doing a number of things sort of behind the doors, this conversation with the IFC leadership women, and now looking at the domestic workers photographic exhibition and thinking about ways that we can get exposure for it in other places, including in Geneva. But most of my time is to be spent with staff, you as an entire group, and then with different groups working with different technical issues and so on. And it's why I wanted to come here to meet you. You have the largest staff of any regional office in the ILO. And although I don't know each and every one of you, I've been hearing in my nearly 3 years at ILO about the wonderful talent that we have in the Asia Pacific region and in this office in particular. And so I wanted to get an opportunity to meet you firsthand. Let me say just a little bit about where we are in the reorganization. I'm sure that you're interested in that and hearing again from headquarters. And then there's been a number of questions that have been put forward, and I think that Sophie is going to voice those questions, which you wrote, but she will pose to me, and so we'll come to that. In terms of the reorganization, so it was launched after Guy Ryder took office October 1. Well, we actually were already talking about it once he was elected, before he took office, talking about the various challenges that we wanted to meet and then ways that we could do it. The challenges that we wanted to meet, what were they? There was a perception inside the ILO, I'm sure one that might have been shared by many of you, that was expressed during the interviews by the transition team that Guy set up. There was a perception among constituents, including governments. Before I came to ILO, I was working in the US government, where I was most recently heading international labor affairs at the Department of Labor. And I know, as one of the constituents, as a member of the governing body and ILC, we had this perception, a widespread perception, that the ILO had a lot of resources. Now, we would say, of course, that financial resources we don't have anywhere near enough, but that we had a lot of resources in terms of staff, in terms of both the number of our staff, but in particular the quality of our staff, and locations and presence in different countries. And yet there was a perception that ILO was not, let's use the boxing expression, not punching up to its weight, that the ILO could have more impact with the resources it had, and that part of the problem, quite frankly, was the way we were organized. That we were organized very much in silos. We were organized in ways, not only the nature of the regional country offices, departmental structures at headquarters, not just the sort of organization, but in the ways that we made our work plan and reported on our work, that it was very compartmentalized. And so you would end up having people in small units. I'll use the headquarters example, which I know best. You would have people in small units with 2 or 3 or at most 4 people working on very important issues with huge demand from constituents from the world. And yet, because there were only 3 or 4 of them, what they would take on as the work plan was actually very micro. I mean, it was a small part of what needed to be done, because that was all that realistically could be done by that number of people. And then you had another unit of 2 or 3 people working on another issue. Well, very often those two issues were quite related to each other in terms of how the challenge presents itself out in the world of work, how it presents itself to governments or to employers or to workers' organizations. And so we thought, let's get these structures which have people in very small cubbyholes, let's try to get those structures out of the way as much as we can, put people together in larger groups around topics that bring together more facets of the work. And then we will have both larger teams, but more importantly, we'll be able to take on bigger aspects of the questions. So that's what we tried to do with the policy portfolio reorganization. So we went from 4 sectors, 4 policy sectors, which themselves were entirely distinct, I can tell you, in terms of budget, in terms of resources, very distinct and only ad hoc collaboration. We went from 4 to 1 policy portfolio instead of 4 sectors. Now, we still had to have some kind of departmental structure. So 500 people report to me. You can't just have one big department. It's not going to work. You need better management streams than that. But we took what in effect had been basically 26 departments or major groupings within those 4 sectors, and we put them into 7 policy departments, plus creating a new research department, plus statistics. And so from 4 to 1, from 26 or 27 to a total of 9, including the new research department, which didn't exist. So in a way, we got a lot of structure out of the way to put people into more coherent groupings. In the new structure, that created or opened new positions, which replaced ones that had existed before. We had competitions for those. It has not always been the case that D1 and D2 positions were competed, but we did compete those positions. Had a lot of interest from staff, and many were competed both externally and internally, a few only internally because of the deep specialization required. And so we got people into leadership positions who we think are very capable of leading. And so we have this more, I would call it a much more open structure as a fundamental way of working. And then we introduced, and I think looking back, we might have made some different decisions, but we introduced the idea of creating the ACIs, the areas of critical importance, which cut across those departments. Not in every case. So one department is social protection, and the building social protection floors is clearly mainly a social protection department function, although social protection floors certainly involve people in some other departments as well. But when I say, we might have made some different decisions, we made the decision that we should hold on to the strategic policy framework, which still had 2 years to run at that time when Guy was coming into office and I was helping, with the 19 outcomes. But then we were going to try to force more collaboration across departments, across expertise, by focusing on these 8 critical challenges that demanded collaboration. Now, when I say we might have done things differently, we might have either gone to the 8 focus areas and decided to step away in the next biennium from the 19 outcomes, or kept the 19 outcomes and tried to develop work method, because it turned out it was quite challenging, and I'm sure all of you have felt some of those challenges, to have this structure of 19 things that we were supposed to do and keep focused on, and then 8 things, not the same, that we were supposed to do and keep focused on, and it was quite a challenge. But we did it, and it was done for the reason I told you, which is even after we got a lot of the silos out of the way, we really simplified the structure, we still needed to go beyond that. And if we were going to work on, for example, the first area of critical importance, more and better jobs, that had to be a collaboration that involved employment policy, that involved enterprises, that involved research, that involved statistics. And so we were determined to try to force this greater collaboration, and the ACIs were the vehicle. We had very tough going. I know a lot of you were in the ACI task teams, are still in the ACI task teams, and so at the beginning people were trying to figure out what is this new thing? Can it work? Does it work? How does it work? Will it help my work? Will it help me to produce and deliver better results for constituents, to satisfy the demands? And looking back, I think after about a year and 4 or 5 months of really trying to do that, we actually have learned a lot about cross-departmental task teams. We've learned how hard it is, but we've also learned some very good lessons about how to do it. And some of the ACIs more than others, all of them to some degree, some to a fairly advanced degree, focused in on a few things that we thought we could do well in these critical areas, and in a few countries that we could pilot, and really tried to narrow the focus because we were doing something that was so new to us. And those that really narrowed the focus to a few issues where we thought we could raise our game and do better, and in a few countries, those actually are producing results. When we went to the governing body meeting in November, well, I guess this month, just earlier this month, we were presenting 2 of the 8 ACIs to the governing body, where we had summary papers of what was the strategy, what were the goals, what were the main deliverables, and where were we in the process. We're doing 2 of these at each governing body during the biennium for the 8 ACIs. And one of them was on decent work in the rural economy, which has been very difficult for us to do because some of you may know, if everybody in the room looks pretty young, but at one time the ILO had enormous capacity to work on rural development and rural livelihoods. But like many other, international organizations, the World Bank, some academics, there was a stepping away from the focus on agriculture and rural development in the 80s, and the ILO stayed focused on it longer than the bank and some others, but we eventually really did turn our attention away. And so we had to rebuild, and that began with a process of a conference debate, I think, in 2008, and putting some limited resources. But what we wanted to do now was really get back to where the ILO had something valuable, concrete, specific to offer on the question of developing opportunities for decent work in rural economies. A lot of skeptics, I can tell you, when we proposed that as one of the topics, and yet the governments in the governing body, particularly from the developing regions, and most particularly from Africa and Asia, insisted we should do this, that the ILO had been away too long from the rural economy, and so we were doing it. Well, we gave our report, and this is one where we really tried to focus on a few things that we could do better. If we have time later, I can talk about it, but a few things we could do better and a few countries where we could try to do it. And the reaction from the governing body, particularly from the governments, was enormously positive. They were surprised that we had got this far this fast, and they said, keep on doing it and do it in the next biennium. Keep on looking at the rural economy in the next biennium. The problems that present themselves to us in the rural economy in some cases are not so different than in the urban economy, but in many cases they are very different. We have to take on different challenges. And so we got a lot of good feedback from the governments in particular on that. So these are some examples of what we've tried to do, why we tried to do it, where we stand, where, maybe we made the right decisions. They were for good reasons. The ACIs, as I say, have been quite tough. The lessons we learned from implementing the ACIs will absolutely inform our work in the program and budget 16-17, which you've also all been working on. And now we have what you might consider the luxury that we will no longer have 19 outcomes and 8 ACIs, but we will have 10 outcome areas. So the planning and the reporting will be more streamlined. The coordination will be more essential. It will be forced because everybody's budget is going to have to fit into these 10 areas, and so that forces people to think about their contribution to issues that are not maybe the way that they previously conceived it, which might have been a bit narrow. So that's important. Of course, we will have cross-cutting areas as well, gender and others, that will apply to all 10. So we've learned from the ACIs. We think that the 10 outcome areas going forward is going to be a better structure, just like we think the headquarters structure now is much better, much more streamlined, less compartmentalized, fewer silos. And so that's where we are at headquarters. Now, of course, the spotlight has shifted over to you, the regions, and the implementation of the field structure review and decisions that were made, the preliminary decisions that were made by the DG and the senior management team. And so you are right in the midst of what we were taking on, back in the summer of 13 and the fall of 13. And quite frankly, our reform is done. I mean, some people ask, is this reform ever going to end? The one we started first, which was on the policy departments, is done. It's been completely done for a year. the last piece to get in place was a research department, because it got involved in some politics in the governing body, and so it took longer to work through those. But everything is in place, and the leadership positions are filled, and the people are in their new structures and their new relationships. In most cases, they have been there for over a year now. And we are absolutely seeing the results. We are seeing people taking on more complex questions, taking on questions at a higher level with a broader scope. We're seeing a lot more collaboration across departments, and it's having an impact. In a few very important policy venues, I can say that we have really made a significant change in the way we are able to play our role. One of them being the G20, which I just came from in Australia. The summit was held in Brisbane this past weekend. The ILO is involved in the G20 now to an extent and at a level that it never was before. We were invited to the table in the past, but we very often didn't even have a speaking role, or if we did, we were supposed to speak on a narrowly selected subjects. We're now participating in the Sherpa track, which leads to the Summit of Leaders. We're participating in the employment track, we're participating in the development working group, and we're also participating in the finance working group, which monitors the macroeconomic commitments of countries. So we're much more involved, and we're seriously engaged in the debate. We're producing inputs to them, and in some cases, I won't say all, this is not easy. This is where really the global economic policy consensus is formed, and it's as subject to debate as where the economic policy should be always is, in which you observe yourself, I'm sure. But nevertheless, we have been able to have some influence on it. We think a rather strong influence last year, during the Russian presidency, when they were open to a lot of our macroeconomic policies, the need for work on the demand side, the need for work for better wages, higher household incomes, better social protection. This year with Australia, they have not wanted to focus so much on that, so it's been a bit of a effort to keep those issues squarely on the table, but I think we did. The final communique, which reflects the consensus, is not bad. I don't know if you had a chance to read it. It's up on the web. Also on the G20 website, you'll find a paper. I have a copy somewhere, which I can leave here, and if you can't easily find it, you can make hard copies and distribute, but it's called Global Employment and Labor Market Outlook Challenges and Policy Responses, something like that. So it was a paper that was prepared by ILO, OECD, and World Bank, but very much with ILO in the lead and influencing both the outline and the final content of the paper, that we delivered to the G20 labor and employment ministers in September, and was very, very important in shaping the labor ministers' declaration, and then ultimately reflected in the leaders. So we could not have done that without the restructuring that put more people together in bigger groups who could think about bigger issues. When you're on the G20 stage, they don't want a perfectly detailed little micro policy on one discrete issue. They want to talk about how it all fits together. So the restructuring has helped us to do that. We have worked very hard to reset our relationship with the World Bank. And this is something which is going to be very relevant to you, because most of the work up until now has been done with headquarters. But gradually we want it ultimately to have its impact in the country level, where you will have relationships hopefully that are set within a context where there is a recognition, a willing recognition by the bank staff at country level to say that the issues that we're pursuing are good for development, and they're good for the goals that the bank is pursuing as well. So we worked on that. I won't go into any more detail on it now, but we worked on that, and we've made a huge amount of progress. I mean, we are just in the final stages of developing a labor law reform manual that it's a bank document for their country staff on 4 key areas of labor law. They invited us to help them write it. It would still be their product for their staff, but that they asked for us to be a full participant in writing it. We basically rewrote the manual for what labor law reform should be, from one that was a sort of a traditional bank approach, which is get the government out of the way, less regulation of labor markets, not very much informed by the World Development Report in 2013 on jobs, which actually found that the empirical basis for that advice was not strong, that there's actually a very positive role for regulation in labor markets. It's a question of getting it right, getting the balance of protection of workers and economic growth and interest of firms. Both by referencing that report, which the bank had done, which was very good, but which had been put on a shelf, but referencing our own research, our own analysis, and our own views on the policy advice, we pretty much rewrote that manual. And so we're on the last draft now. We'll see how it comes out at the end of the day. Hopefully no censor will get to it in the bank and weaken it back. But it's policy advice for country staff of the World Bank, which is entirely consistent with the policy advice that you would offer to them, that we would offer to them. Well, that's pretty enormous. I mean, the bank comes in with a checkbook. We don't usually come in with a checkbook. And so their advice tends to get a certain extra attention as a result of that. And the bank has not always been giving good policy advice on labor market reform. So if we can get them to give good advice in an environment where they may very well be listened to, where we may not get a call, we have advanced our mandate. We have been able to then effectuate things that we want to do by relating to another organization and helping to change their policy prescriptions, but then also leveraging their reach and their influence. So I think I'll stop there in terms of background of what we're doing. I know there are going to be questions about the relationship between headquarters and field, obviously, especially in the context of the field reform, but I think I'll answer them in terms of the questions as they were asked, Sophie.
Great. Thank you very much, Sandra. Perhaps I could just ask you to wrap up your comments on G20, just to say if you have any idea of what Turkey takes over the chairmanship, have we any idea of what their policy agenda priorities are going to be for their chairmanship?
Well, we got a preview at the end of the summit on Sunday. This past Sunday, there was a lunch, and at the very end of the lunch, Turkey was invited to talk about their priorities. It was late in the day. The leaders had to go in their motorcades to their planes, and so it was very compressed. But in our areas of interest, they went through. I was lettering them A, B, C, D, and I think I got up to J or K. So they have quite a number of priorities. But in our main mandate areas, they have several things on their agenda that will be quite important for us, which I'll tell you about. But first, to say that as a cross-cutting issue, one of their two cross-cutting issues is to focus on the development impact of everything that they do during their year as presidency of G20. So G20 in 2011 under the Seoul, 10 or 11, when Korea was the host, they launched the Seoul Declaration on how the G20 could help developing countries and help development, and they launched the development working group of the G20. So what Turkey is saying now is, well, that development working group will continue under our presidency, and we certainly will give it full attention and resources, but we want development and the interests of particularly low and lower middle income countries to be a cross-cutting issue in everything we do. When we think about financial sector reform, we want part of that discussion to be how it's going to influence lower middle income countries. When we think about tax reform, same thing. So that's very welcome. I think that will it will be a year in which we are in our sort of natural environment, because of course our membership spans all levels of income, and we focus a lot on what happens in developing and emerging economies, to use the G20 phrase, but in LDCs, low income and lower middle income countries that ask us for assistance. So we think that's going to be a very benign environment for ILO participation as a cross-cutting theme. Then in terms of specific areas, they have 2 and possibly 3 areas that relate very directly to our mandate. One, and they are quite focused on this, we spoke with the Prime Minister at the end of the meeting, and I have spoken with their Sherpa, and we have spoken with their Labor Ministry, and they have all told us the same message. They want to look at the relationship between growth and employment. Are we witnessing jobless growth? Or where are we witnessing jobless growth? Because the point I come back to them is, you're witnessing relatively jobless growth, almost no growth in jobs compared to the growth rate of the economy in some places. In other places, they've not delinked as much, but so there's a spectrum. But the trend in general is less jobs for an equivalent unit of growth. And then the question that they have to they talked about focusing on that issue, but what we're saying to them is, why? What is responsible for this delinking? And obviously there's been a lot of thinking and research about this for a while now, since we've been seeing the declining employment intensity of growth. Different international organizations have different takes. Is it primarily because of technology? We say technology is a factor, but actually some of our modeling says the biggest factor is the increasing weight of the financial sector in many economies, that seems to be the biggest correlation. Globalization itself, the weakening of workers' bargaining power as a result of globalization, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot of diagnostic, but what we hope Turkey will do is look at what is the pattern of the employment intensity of growth across the G20 itself and beyond. And then what are the factors leading to this? What is the relative weight of different factors in different countries or areas? Because when you get to that is when you can begin to come up with policy responses. If you know what are the causal factors. So the issue of the relationship between employment and growth, they have put on the agenda, and I've told you a bit about how we're coming back to them about how to approach it. So we think we could have, Sophie, a very, very important role, maybe the biggest role yet next year under the Turkish presidency on that question. Second question that they have definitely put on the agenda, one more I'll come to where they're still not quite sure, but the second one is, why are we seeing a decline in the labor share of GDP? So this is, again, a trend which in some countries has been going on for 10, 20, 30, some cases 40 years, where overall GDP divided between the share that goes to capital and the share that goes to labor, the labor share has been trending down in some countries for decades. In other countries it was not, but it has begun to more recently. And in a few countries it is not trending down. So again, a differentiated pattern, but overall at a global level, at a G20 level, a decline in labor share. We are delighted they put this on the agenda because, quite frankly, it was the ILO that first put it on the G20 agenda during the Russian year, and it got some attention, but it never made it into the consensus program and follow-up action. So we're delighted that Turkey on its own initiative is saying this is important, we've got to understand this, because if we want to have inclusive growth that raises living standards, we've got to look at this. So again, we are very happy to work with them on that. The third area, and this is where they're still thinking, is what they're calling labor mobility. Not necessarily migration as we would typically think of it in all its dimensions, but mobility, and they're specifically thinking about the refugee crisis in their part of the world. Huge spillover of refugees from various conflict zones into neighboring countries, of which Turkey is one, and getting a huge number of refugees. And they want to put it on the agenda because really it's almost a cry of pain. International community, you have to help us. We can't deal with this alone. Jordan can't deal with it, et cetera, et cetera. But they're hesitating a little bit because in the G20, there is a very strong preconception that G20 is, as they described themselves when they decided to become the G20, the premier economic policy coordination forum. And they want to keep the emphasis on economic, and they don't want to get to political issues. There are other fora for that, the UN most notably, the Security Council, General Assembly, but others as well, regional political and security bodies, and they don't want the G20 to be pulled off what it considers its value added and its center of gravity, which is economic policy. And they're saying the refugee crisis, that veers very much into the political realm and the security realm. So they're still working on that. If they want to deal with it, of course, this is another area where ILO has, we have values, we have conventions, certainly on migration. We have a lot of work that we've done in terms of refugee situations, post-crisis situations, et cetera. And so we would be able to help there too if they decide to do it. But so that's some of the main outcome from G20 that will inform the Turkish year and our participation in it.
Great. Sandra, thank you very much for that introduction.